Melbourne, Australia. In the 1960s, a young John Glover, who would later be known as Australia's infamous granny killer, was living here. And elderly women were, at the same time, being mysteriously murdered.
I take it today's search is for the murder weapon.
Well, yes, and that and anything else which it may reveal.
This man would go on to become the worst killer of women Australia had ever seen. But back in the 1960s, a young, dapper, good-looking Glover wasn't considered a murder suspect. It's possible that this evil man, convicted of murdering just 6 women in Sydney, actually killed a dozen elderly women across Australia and got away with those crimes.
It wouldn't have been the first time he'd done something like this.
We've asked Kris Illingsworth, an FBI-trained criminal profiler who worked on the Granny Killer Task Force, to help us analyse his other possible murders.
John Glover was a danger to women for decades.
There were certainly more than 6. Mrs. Irene Kittle was murdered, and she lived about 10 minutes away from where we lived.
Irene Kittle was killed in 1963 outside her home on the corner of High Street and St Kilda Road.
We found out from that lady who was the housekeeper that he'd actually been questioned about that murder because someone had dobbed him in. Kathy had given him an alibi with what she'd said he came home at such and such a time. The difference in time that Kathy gave him the alibi for was about 10 minutes, I think. So there was time for him to have gone and done that and come back again. So then the police never followed that through after that.
Tell me about Kathy. Do you think that Kathy was in love with him, and do you think that she suspected that he might have been responsible for the murder?
Kathy, I think, was in love with him. I do believe she was, and they got on so well together. You know, I still don't believe that she gave him an alibi knowingly. He would have tricked her. John Glover had a gift of being able to manipulate people. He knew exactly what to say and what to do. We were no match for that guy. He was just an amazing criminal. He was a bad, bad man.
But FBI-trained criminal profiler Kris Illingsworth, a former homicide detective on the task force assigned to catch Glover, says there's more to it than just the circumstantial evidence.
There is another piece of information that, for me, confirms this was Glover. When Glover was in custody for the North Shore murders, he was spoken to about a number of Victorian murders, these Melbourne murders. He denied any involvement or knowledge of the murders, but the interviewing police officer showed him a map of Melbourne and just said, "OK, could you just show me where you were living at the time?" And Glover orientated the map to himself. He apparently had a very good look at where things were on the map. And he's taken the pen and put an X on the map and said that's where I lived. And when the Victorian Homicide Police were informed about this and shown the map, they were astonished because it was exactly on top of the crime where the ladder had been used and the peep and pry offences had occurred, and that's Irene Kittle. So he'd actually marked Irene Kittle's exact spot on the map. He didn't live there at all.
So he pinpointed this particular crime.
This actual crime.
About which he should know nothing.
That's right.
If you had to say whether Irene Kittle was killed by John Glover, what would you say?
My view, when you add in the prowler activity and the voyeurism activity that we know he was doing, and the proximity of where he was going from that night with his girlfriend in Middle Park, and then this astounding information about marking the X on the Melbourne map. In my view, this is a certain John Glover murder.
We know so much about the monster from Mossman, but we've shown in our series that a younger John Glover also killed.
Well, hello there. Deep in it.
But besides interviews with people that knew him at the time, we don't know what he looked like. We needed some old photos of a young granny killer, and our crime researcher Laura Banks was determined to find them.
Do you know what's really intriguing to me? I'm really interested to know what John Wayne Glover was like when he was a younger man. And we've got this sense of him as being, you know, an older, married father living in Mossman. But as a younger man, he was apparently really charismatic and dapper and good-looking, handsome. Wouldn't you love to know what he looked like?
Absolutely. We need to know what he looked like because it's so integral to stitching together his story and for us to know how he became this monster. Patricia has these negatives that she's found in the back of her wardrobe that she thinks are from a trip that John took to Sydney. Now, Patricia's ex-husband was a pilot. So, to impress their Melbourne friends, they took out John on this light Cessna airplane, doing laps of Sydney Harbour. And she says that, you know, by virtue of the amazing time they were having, or taking photographs to document what they'd done.
There's a good chance it could be a photo of the young John Glover.
She says that they definitely took photos. It's just whether or not these negatives that she's found buried at the back of her wardrobe are the ones that we really want. It's the missing piece. It's how we get to know him. We get to see what he looked like before he became the monster. We know what he looked like as the monster. It's been so well publicised. But what did he look like when he was in his prime? As soon as they're developed, she's promised to send me the shots. These negatives could very well show John Glover in the 60s as this dapper, young, sprightly man.
This is Annie Mae Anderson. What is it about this murder that makes you think she could be a victim of John Glover?
Annie Mae Anderson was murdered in Clarendon Terrace in East Melbourne. She was the landlady of this block of flats. Now, it looks like Annie Mae had gone to bed for the evening, but for some reason she'd exited her apartment, probably to go to the bathroom, which was down the corridor. The offender has come into the building and I believe because he's probably seen the light on and may have seen a woman's outline there or realised there was a woman there, and he's entered the building, gone up to the first floor. Now, she's been stabbed once in the chest. During this time, the offender has lifted up her nightdress, removed her underwear, pulled down one stocking, but left the other one there. But we know this offender is a sex offender of some kind. So there are reasons to think that this could have been Glover.
He's seen a reasonably elderly woman, a shadow perhaps of her, suspects she's alone, and he is a peeping Tom, and we know that. And this is around the same time that he's operating as a peeping Tom and a voyeur in Melbourne, not too far from the other offences that we've already indicated.
That's right. This was a voyeur's activity and a prowler's activity, someone who doesn't mind coming onto other people's properties at night. So that's a similarity with Glover. Given the scenario of it being indoors in the victim's home, it is different to Glover. But then again, we have the single stab wound just doing as much as what was necessary to gain control over the victim, which is what we do see later in the North Shore murders. And it looks like he's probably wiped his fingerprints from this knife, so it's an offender who's had contact before with police, which Glover had through the peep and pry activities. He knew that if the prints were on there, he could be identified that way.
And again, this is 20 or 30 years before the known killings in Sydney and in a different state. Could it be someone who is, again, just starting out?
I think this offender has actually got some history behind him with sexual assault, alcohol offences, breaking and entering, peeping and prying. Now, Glover was known to be in this area generally, so we definitely see similarities with Glover.
She looks like such a lovely woman. It's hard to believe that she came to such a terrible end.
Yeah, this was a tragic death.
Kris, do you think that Enid May Anderson was killed by John Glover?
I think there are some reasons to include him. If you're an investigator, you want to have him in your pool of suspects. Glover could have done this.
In the early 1960s, John Glover had met and was dating his soon-to-be wife, Gay, in Melbourne. They'd sometimes visit her wealthy, Sydney-based parents. Also in the 1960s, the mysterious and brutal murder of an elderly woman about 4 kilometres from where John was known to visit his soon-to-be in-laws. This is Mary Jane Cardellini. What is it about her death that makes you think she could be a victim of John Glover?
Mary Jane Cardellini was an 82-year-old lady. She was found in her front yard at 99 Union Street in North Sydney in 1960 on the October public holiday Monday. She'd been out that evening down to the local shops.
And that suggests that she was followed home from the shops, which we know is a common Glover scenario.
I think he's come from a different direction, but still seen Mary walking on the street. She lived with her 2 sons, and they'd been out for the day, and they came home. One of them saw Mary lying face up in the front yard on the grass. Her groceries were strewn around her body, so she's been attacked there, and it looks like she's actually been forced backwards. Mary's been assaulted badly around the face. This is only happening a few metres away from that pathway that she had been walking along, so it's a very high-risk crime. He's then removed her stockingette from her lower leg and tossed one shoe to one side of the body and one shoe to the other side of the body.
This is a more violent crime than we might expect with Glover, but there are some similarities. The stockings, the shoes.
Yes, that's right. It's clearly a sexually motivated crime.
Kris, do you believe that Mary Jane Cardellini was murdered by John Glover?
No, I don't. She was actually raped in a violent way. Now, we don't know of Glover doing that in any of his crimes. And also significantly for Glover, who was quite meticulous in his crimes, in how he placed the shoes. One stocking had been removed, not the other, and neither had been used to strangle her. So those things were quite different.
Learn to draw. The most important thing of all is learning to draw.
Florence Broadhurst was a visionary designer.
This belongs to a club in Perth, a nightclub in Perth. I think those colours are quite magnificent.
The 78-year-old businesswoman lived in the suburb of Paddington. She was a fixture of the 1970s Sydney society. her Australian empire took off, many luxury homes had Florence Broadhurst wallpaper, and soon homes around the world boasted Broadhurst designs.
Yes, it was designed for a job in Saudi Arabia. I went out to Saudi Arabia.
She was glamorous, self-made, successful. She was brutally murdered at her Sydney studio in 1977. Now FBI-trained profiler and former New South Wales homicide detective Kris Illingsworth, who worked on the Granny Killer Murders Task Force, picks apart that crime for us.
Florence had sustained a number of blunt force trauma injuries to her face and around her head, and there'd been clearly a violent struggle that had taken place.
Whoever stalked and killed Florence on that Saturday afternoon in 1977 wanted to make sure she was well and truly dead.
So this is overkill. It's coming from a point of rage. He's not satisfied with just bashing her around the head till she's dead and moving her around the room. He wants to now degrade her and humiliate her by sticking her head into the toilet.
But missing police files, corruption, and a lacklustre investigation means that for the past 44 years, her only son, Robert, has not known who killed his mother. To this day, Florence's murder remains a mystery.
Well, it's a lack of closure. I mean, I want to know why as well. I mean, if you can understand why, you can understand maybe the motive. There's no closure.
The granny killer, John Wayne Glover, knew Florence Broadhurst. His sister-in-law was employed by Florence, and John Glover met the famous designer at a wedding, and then later visited her at her Paddington studio.
When Glover and his wife Gay wanted to buy some wallpaper for their home in Wyong Road at Mossman, they went to the lady that they knew, Florence Broadhurst, and purchased the wallpaper which hung in their house. So definitely a strong connection between Glover and Florence Broadhurst.
So, when Glover was revealed as a serial killer, the unsolved murder of Florence Broadhurst was investigated again. The granny killer is often mentioned when Florence Broadhurst's unsolved murder is discussed. Could it have been another of the granny killer's brutal crimes?
This offender approached her in her workplace on a Saturday afternoon around 4 p.m. while there was no one else around. And he's gone upstairs to where she was working. So this offender shows familiarity with this workplace. He knew where he's going, he's confident about going in there, not being disturbed, knew where she was. Glover could have gone in and entered the premises.
It's a little desolate down this way, and anything that was a bit untoward may have been seen by somebody that might be able to assist us, and we're making an appeal along those lines.
I guess what's perplexing and distressing from my point of view is that there doesn't seem to have been an awful lot done to solve this crime, the murder of your mother.
There's been very little done, and one wonders whether or not there was a lack of enthusiasm for certain reasons.
What would explain it?
Well, my mother was a person who would speak out, and she was a friend of previous Commissioner Delaney, who was against corruption in the police force, and she certainly spoke out and supported Delaney.
Robert maintains he was always worried about his mother, who often carried large sums of cash, becoming a victim of robbery.
There'd been an argument just the day before, a loud argument apparently with her son, Robert. And she had a number of incidents where money was being stolen from her handbag. And he'd been telling her for some time, look, you've got to do better with your handbag, keep the money safe. And they had a bit of a blow-up on that Friday. Apparently everyone in the workplace heard it, and he was telling her, look, there's $8,000, you've got to secure it. So if this offender had been close by, they would have heard this conversation and realised, A, there's $8,000, and B, the $8,000 would not be available in a few days' time.
It's for these reasons, perhaps it was someone who overheard that argument about money or worked with her and knew about the large sums of cash she often carried, that Florence's son Robert has made up his mind about the unsolved crime often connected with the granny killer. He believes it had to be somebody much closer to Florence.
I honestly don't believe John Glover had anything to do with my mother's death. But there's a possibility, very faint.
A conclusion too settled on by our investigator, Kris Illingsworth. Did John Glover kill Florence Broadhurst?
No, I don't believe he did. I believe this was another robbery crime, a motivated homicide. From my interpretation, this was someone connected to the premises, most likely an employee or someone associated with an employee. There was no sexual interference with Florence at all. And to me, there's too many indicators that this was just a straight robbery homicide.
John Glover's victims were all on Sydney's leafy North Shore. Most of his known murders were committed within 3 kilometres of his Mossman home. But in the 1980s, Glover's pie sales round was expanded to include the Central Coast, about an hour and a half north of Sydney. And just as he began work in the region, some 5 years before his 6-murder killing spree, 2 elderly women were killed.
One of the most intriguing murders that we've been looking at, Josephine McDonald. Why do we think that this might be a John Glover murder?
Yeah, Josephine McDonald was a 73-year-old woman who was murdered in her home at Ettalong on the Central Coast. She was found inside her home in the hallway, and she'd been strangled with her own pantyhose, and she'd sustained several blunt force trauma injuries to her head from a weapon.
We know that John Glover was working in that area, and the similarities are the pantyhose around the neck, the trauma to the back of the head.
And she's killed inside a home, which is similar to Muriel Falconer. But certainly the pantyhose being strangled around her throat is one of John Wayne Glover's signatures.
Remember, Muriel Falconer was John Glover's 5th known murder, killed in Mossman just inside her home. Kris can see a few distinct similarities with those later crimes.
Covering up her face as well.
And covering up, we see that repeatedly in the other victims.
And the fact that the front door to the house was open, does that suggest to you another one of those situations where he's followed her home?
Yeah, it does. So she may have even been outside in the daytime and her clothing has been removed.
And the fact that the police still have the file and they are still investigating possible murders committed by John Glover suggests that this is very likely a John Glover homicide victim.
Yes, in my view, this has all the hallmarks of John Wayne Glover's crimes.
Two years later, still a few years before the Mossman murders, another elderly lady on the Central Coast was killed in mysterious circumstances.
Kris, this is Wanda Amundsen. Why do we think this could be one of John Glover's murder victims?
Wanda Amundsen was an 83-year-old lady. She lived in Nelson Street, Umina, on her own. And Wanda was found deceased in her home. Now, when they entered the hallway, they found Wanda lying deceased on her back. She had blunt force trauma. There's signs of robbery here. Now, she was an elderly lady living on her own, a bit like Muriel Falconer. Muriel was attacked in her home too. And of course, you've got Joan Sinclair, who was attacked in her home by Glover.
Joan Sinclair was the granny killer's final murder. She let him into her home, only to be killed by Glover. And there's another, perhaps more disturbing connection with the New South Wales Central Coast. John Glover's mother, Frida Underwood, also moved to Australia from England in the 1970s, 20 years after her son. Soon after, she retired to the Central Coast.
So the location where they were residing was not very far from Wanda's location at all, very short distance. So Glover was known to come up and visit his family up there, and also he engaged in some pie salesman work as well around this area.
Is this a possible Glover crime? Can you see why, for example, the family believe that John Glover might be involved?
Yeah, on the surface, it does look like it. She's an elderly lady and she's killed by a blunt force weapon on top of the head, which is similar to Glover's known crimes.
We needed to hear the story direct from Wanda's family. So I asked researcher Laura Banks to find them.
So where are we at with Wanda Amundsen?
Well, we don't yet know if there are any surviving relatives. Articles at the time name a son. So I'm a bit hopeful. I've done some research, property title research, put an Amundsen with a house in Bass Hill, which is in Western Sydney. I've been out there, no one was home, but these lovely old Greek couple who live next door tell me that it is the Amundsen that's related to Wanda. The son has died, but there are grandchildren who they tell me are very aware of what happened and very affected by it.
And is there a grandchild in particular that we're looking for? Do we know who it is?
I believe Helen is her name. She would have been about 19 or 18 at the time.
Oh, she'll definitely remember then.
Absolutely. You would never forget your grandmother passing away, especially like that.
Laura eventually got in touch with Helen Sloan, Wanda's granddaughter. She agreed to speak to us because they had one of those loving relationships that defies the generation gap. Look at her smile.
Yeah,
She loved being a nan, didn't she?
She did, yes. So big cuddles there. She was just a sweet little grey-haired lady. She was always immaculately dressed and the hair was always done beautiful. Yeah, she was a lovely, lovely, lovely lady.
And did you get the feeling that you were pretty loved by her?
Oh, yes, yeah. It was always lovely walking in and getting that big hug, you know. Yeah.
And was she a relatively active lady?
Yes, yeah. So she was a member of a couple of the clubs up there, and I think there was a ladies' group that she was involved with as well. She would walk to the bus stop and she'd still get out. She was very independent that way.
Everything changed for Helen and her family when she was 19.
What do you remember about the day of her death?
So we got a phone call in the afternoon. I was actually up at my boyfriend's place, which is now my husband, to say that I had to come home. Don't ask any questions, just come home. So I thought that was a bit odd. So I got home and there was police cars out the front, and I thought, what's going on here? And I walked in and Mum greeted me at the front door. And I said, what's going on? I said, are the police here? And she said, yes. She said, Nan's been found murdered. Sorry. So, I just remember running into my room and just sort of trying to work out how, why, how do you make sense of who would want to do this? And there was just so many questions that kept coming up. Because she was just such a beautiful woman. And she was my nan. She was my only grandparent that I had. So yeah, it was devastating. Like, who would want to do that to someone?
Police told Helen's father what they thought had happened to Wanda.
We know that she was at home. He told me that she was in the hallway of the house. It looked like more of an accident because she'd been propped up with pillows and had a blanket over her.
And did the police give the family any idea when it happened? What time of day?
I'm pretty sure it was during the day. It was quite strange because the house was broken into and Nan had passed, but her bank books were still there. There was money still there. The jewellery was still there. It didn't look like the house had been ransacked for anything. There was a little statue that had gone missing and a couple of other photos that she'd had on display in the lounge room on a sideboard. So it was just very bizarre to try and work out why.
Did they discuss with you how she was killed?
The suspicion was a hammer.
That she'd been
bludgeoned.
Bludgeoned?
Yes.
She'd been hit, certainly, and that she perhaps hadn't seen it coming?
Glover's weapon of choice, used against his vulnerable prey, was a hammer. He used it at almost every murder, striking and subduing his victims quickly, usually from behind. Crime author Lindsay Simpson recalls him speaking about the peculiar way he used that deadly weapon.
He said that they couldn't work out with the blood spatters how he'd hit them with the ball of the hammer, and in fact he said to us, no, I turned the hammer round. And that was how I got away with people not realising that was the implement I was using, which was quite chilling, the fact that he'd even thought of it to that point. And the fact that he went back to the family home to put hydrochloric acid on the hammer and having killed someone was also chilling.
So what we can see in the murders is this pattern of behaviours that's designed to satisfy needs, psychological needs in the offender. Now, the blunt force trauma would have been satisfying, but it served a functional purpose. This way you can inflict the wounds, in this case from behind, and you can be that hammer length distance from the victim. So that was really important. They had to not interact with him. He had to be completely in control, all-powerful. They were at his mercy.
Years after Wanda Amundsen was murdered, with the case still unsolved, police contacted the family.
Do you recall how the name John Wayne Glover came up?
Detective on Nan's case rang my dad and spoke to him and sort of suggested that that may have been the person. He was a person of interest. They can trace him to being in the area and things like that, but they just couldn't connect it 100%. I did do a lot of reading about it because, you know, we thought there was that connection, and I always hoped that the connection was going to be made, even years after when he was in prison. I knew the detective was still going in and asking questions and things like that. And it's like, oh, one day we'll get that phone call, which unfortunately we didn't. I thought, how horrible of a man he must be to pick on grandmothers, like the elderly. I felt bad for the other families because I knew what they were going through. But at least once the connection was made with the others and he confessed to some of the murders, at least they had answers. And it's like, you mongrel, I just don't have an answer.
So would you, given the opportunity, have wanted to eyeball John Wayne Glover?
Absolutely. Yes. To look him face to face and ask him if he did it. And all I would need was a yes or a no, but I would want the truth. And if it was a yes, then why?
Wanda's granddaughter said to us that she wanted to just face him in the courthouse and say, did you do it? What's the likelihood that she'd get an honest answer?
I don't think she would have got an honest answer at all. Not from Glover. Every family wants resolution. They want an answer to what's happened. Every family that doesn't get those answers endures greater, longer grief. And they, of course, wanted to find out who had done this to them.
Even though John Wayne Glover was known to be in the area around this time, profiler Kris Illingsworth isn't quite convinced that the granny killer is responsible for Mrs. Amundson's callous murder.
When you look at the crime scene, there are signs of this being a robbery-motivated crime, not a sexually motivated crime. Wanda was fully clothed, her stockings were on, she was not strangled. This offender had plenty of time and privacy in her home to obtain any item that he wanted to strangle her with, but strangulation did not take place. There's some signs of ransacking, like drawers have been emptied and the contents put out on the beds. This is someone who's searching around for something. It looks like they've decided, let's get money, she's got more money, let's go and look for it, we'll make her tell us where it is. Wanda didn't tell and unfortunately suffered the consequences.
Now, what was it in this guy's life that caused this to happen? Was it ageing? Was it some reminder of his own mortality? What could have got to him to cause this to happen? The one thing that he didn't have in his youth and his association with his mother was much say in what went on. And I think Mother determined what went on. And we can only guess at it, but whatever it was likely to lead to a lot of conflict in John.
The final death linked to the Central Coast and John Glover, this one just before his Mossman killing spree, is the most chilling. His own mother.
This is Frida Underwood, as she was known when she died. This was John Wayne Glover's mother. Frida died in October 1988 at the age of 78. So this was just 5 months before the first known murder that John Wayne Glover committed. Now, Frida died in a hospital. She was dying from cancer, and she'd been transferred to palliative care for her last days. And Glover and his sister went there. The family spent some time in the hospital room with her. And Frida was a woman who always had insecurity around money, so she always liked to have $20 just in case, kept in her purse. So on this day, her daughter Patricia put $20 into her purse just as a kind gesture between the two women. And the family said their last goodbyes to her, believing that she would soon be deceased. They've left the room and they've walked down the corridor of the hospital to leave. Now, down the corridor, Glover has decided to turn around and go back to the room.
He wants to say one last goodbye to his mother.
He's going to do something in that room, say something to her. We know that Glover hated his mother. She had controlled him for many years and had dominated him for many years. So there was no one else in the room with him. He's left the room. A nurse has gone in just moments after he left.
And she's deceased.
That's right. And not just that, but the $20 that his sister had placed into a purse was missing from the purse. So a thief, right to the end of her life, he behaved that way even towards her. Now, the chances of her dying just within seconds, really, of Glover's presence in that room seems a bit too coincidental for me, especially when we have this hatred that we knew he had and her controlling nature over him.
Crime author Lindsay Simpson agrees.
It's very easy, you know, to smother somebody in a nursing home and have them, especially if they're sick, as she was. I think it's quite possible. And he was always an opportunist, always. Like, he acted exactly at that time, at that moment.
Do you believe that John Glover killed his mother?
I think it's highly likely. In all probability, he did.
We know that John Glover hated his mother and later his mother-in-law, women who had control over him. There were those incidents when he was a boy, staring through the peephole at his mother and finding photographs of her in pornographic poses. But we present a new theory, one that wasn't heard by the courts. Our experts believe that John Glover's mother had an inappropriate sexual relationship with her own son. What made you form the impression that he may himself have been abused as a child?
I always thought there was some sexual interference by his mother on him. He never admitted that. He never actually went as far as saying that that's what happened, but I often wondered, what was it? It went beyond just abandonment as a child. There was something else there. When she started having a passion for other people, that he felt hugely rejected, and I think there was quite a confusion over what his role was.
Criminal profiler Kris Illingsworth agrees.
Glover, in his younger days, was highly promiscuous. It's almost like he has to prove to himself, I am sexually attracted to young women, whereas perhaps really he was sexually attracted to older women. And I do have to wonder whether his mother had some kind of sexual interaction with him while he was a child, perhaps a teenager.
There was a lot of things that you could point to where he started going after elderly women after his mother died, getting back and having a revenge against his mother.
John Glover's trial never examined why he killed the women. The judge and jury were only asked to determine his mental state, and they found he wasn't insane.
If his mother did do that to him at a young age, what an appalling kind of legacy to leave a child. And that then paid out in the way that it did to all these women and the rest of his life.
So when you have a narcissist and a psychopath, that's a very dangerous person. And if they are acting out using violence and sexualised violence, then you will have a serial offender, a serial rapist, a serial killer.
Now on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Patricia Balderstone has finally found the never-before-seen photos.
When I found out he was the granny killer, I was totally shocked. I couldn't believe it was the same one. I couldn't believe that I knew him. When I found out about it, I thought, yes, he came looking for me. Yeah, definitely. I think so.
You potentially could have been a victim.
Yeah, I do, Caroline. I do, yes.
Do you think it's possible that John Glover killed other women?
Oh, definitely.
The carefree killer. Never-before-seen photographs of a charismatic young murderer. The shots showed us exactly what we were hoping to find. Candid photos of a young John Wayne Glover. Glover's ability to blend in, to never be the outsider, and earn the trust of his family and friends was one of the serial killer's most cunning assets.
Glover and Kathy, we took them on a picnic. Every Sunday we used to go to Nielsen Park with all this food, and we'd all be eating away on a big picnic rug, you know, because we were like family, because we didn't have family here, so that's what we did.
He's enjoying a picnic in the sun. The same year Irene Kittle was murdered. Going to a fancy dress party around the same time as another woman in Melbourne, Enid May Anderson, was murdered. And also in the 1960s, after his convictions for violent sexual assault, smiling and carefree on a joyride in a light plane.
My ex-husband took Kathy and John flying because he had to keep his hours up in a Cessna, and I've got a photo of them in the cockpit.
That's the thing about the granny killer. Nobody ever suspected him. John Wayne Glover was an evil man, callous and cowardly. People call him the granny killer, but actually his victims were vibrant, intelligent, independent, loving women. We know about 6 of them, but how many more were there? And will we ever get justice for them?